Okay, so let's talk about attraction. We all think we know what it is, right? It's about personality, shared interests, that spark. But what if there's something else going on? Something completely hidden, a kind of biological code that subtly changes who we're drawn to without us even realizing it.
So that brings us to the big question here. Is our attraction actually driven by some kind of hidden biological clock? Today, we're going to dive into a really fascinating and frankly, pretty controversial idea from evolutionary psychology that tries to answer that very question. It's a story about a huge theory, a major scientific showdown, and what we learn from it all.
All right, so the core idea is called the ovulatory shift hypothesis. It was formally laid out in the early 2000s, and the concept itself is pretty straightforward, but wow, is it powerful. It basically says that when a woman's fertility peaks during her cycle, her preferences might subtly shift. All of a sudden, she might be more attracted to men who show off traits that signal good genes. You can think of it like an ancient echo in our biology, nudging the body towards certain choices when the chances of conception are at their highest.
So where did this wild idea even come from? Well, it wasn't just a random guess. It was built on a whole series of really compelling studies that all seemed to be pointing in the same direction, and that's what launched this theory into the scientific spotlight.
The early research on this was, it was electrifying, and the findings were all over the map, in a good way. You had studies suggesting that during their most fertile window, women showed a stronger preference for more masculine-looking faces. And get this, they were also reportedly more attracted to the scent of men who were more symmetrical, which is thought to be a marker for good health. Other studies found a preference for more dominant, confident behaviors, and even, and this was a big one, an increased desire for men who weren't their main partner. This quote from a really foundational paper in 2005 just sums it all up perfectly. The main idea wasn't just a tiny little change in preference, it was a whole pattern. Finding those traditionally masculine features, both in how someone looks and how they act, more appealing. And it was happening precisely when it would matter most from a purely reproductive standpoint.
And this whole thing didn't just appear overnight. The evidence was built up, piece by piece, over years. In '98, that scent study made huge waves. A year later, the study on facial preference added another piece to the puzzle. By 2002, researchers were even suggesting that male partners seemed to be reacting subconsciously, becoming more protective right when their partner was most fertile. It all led up to 2005 when the ovulatory shift hypothesis finally got its official name.
But here's the thing about science. Even the coolest, most convincing ideas have to survive the ultimate test, which is other scientists trying to poke holes in it. And this right here is where our story takes a really dramatic turn.
So for a long time, the ovulatory shift hypothesis was like a textbook example of evolutionary psychology. It seemed to explain this really complex human behavior so perfectly. But then, as more and more scientists tried to replicate these famous findings, the picture started to get, well, messy. That super clear, predictable shift just wasn't showing up consistently in the new data.
And this chart really gets to the core of the whole debate. On one side, you have those original, super exciting claims, but on the other, you have the replication challenges. These newer, much larger studies, we're talking hundreds of participants, better ways of measuring hormones, they started getting different results. They just couldn't reliably find those preference shifts for masculine features. And that supposed spike in desire for other partners? Yeah, the newer research wasn't finding a solid link there either.
This quote from a 2019 paper is a pretty powerful example of that pushback. These researchers reanalyzed the data from an older study, and their conclusion was, well, blunt. They said the original results were not robust. They used this cool technique called a multiverse analysis, which is basically like testing the idea in 100 different ways to see if the effect is real. If it is, it should pop up no matter how you slice the data. In this case, it didn't, and that was a major blow to the original theory.
So the really crucial thing to get here is that this isn't just about one theory. This whole debate is a perfect example of a much bigger conversation happening across all of science, but especially in psychology, and it's called the replicability crisis. It's basically this period of intense self-reflection where scientists are going back and retesting classic, famous findings to see which ones actually hold up. And honestly, it's science working exactly like it's supposed to, by correcting itself.
Okay, so if the original, simple story of a preference shift isn't really holding up, does that just mean biology plays no role? No, not at all. It just means the story is way more complex, and honestly, way more interesting than we first thought. A totally new picture is starting to emerge from all this debate.
And this is the million-dollar question scientists are asking now.
If women aren't necessarily switching their type mid-cycle, what else could possibly be happening? All this conflicting data has forced researchers to get creative and to start exploring some other really fascinating possibilities.
So what are the new leading ideas? Well, one simple one is that it's not about what a woman desires, but just how much. Maybe peak fertility just kicks libido into a higher gear in general, making lots of different potential partners seem more attractive, not just one specific type. Another related idea is that sexual motivation just climbs up the priority list when conception is on the table. But this third one, the life history strategy, is really interesting.
This life history idea basically suggests there isn't one simple pattern that fits everyone. Instead, it might depend on a person's broader life strategy, which is shaped by their environment growing up. Think of it like this. A fast life history, which is often linked to more unpredictable environments, might favor having kids earlier. So for those women, a single, really strong peak of desire right at mid-cycle makes a ton of sense. But a slow life history, linked to more stable environments, might show two peaks, one at ovulation for conception, and maybe another one around menses, possibly to strengthen the bond with a partner.
So, after this whole journey, from a simple, neat idea to a really complex scientific debate, what's the big takeaway? Why does this whole scientific detective story actually matter to any of us?
Well, for one, what we have just walked through is a perfect picture of the scientific process doing its job. A bold idea comes out, initial evidence makes it famous, but then the real hard work of science starts. Other people test it, they challenge it, they poke at it from every angle. And out of that whole messy debate, we don't just get a simple yes or no. We get a much richer, more accurate, and more nuanced understanding of how the world works.
So here's the bottom line. Biology is super important, no doubt, but it isn't destiny. Our hormones are powerful influencers. They can definitely nudge our moods, our energy, and yeah, maybe even our desires. But they are not puppet masters pulling our strings. If this whole debate shows us anything, it's that human attraction is this incredibly complex mix of biology, psychology, our culture, and our own personal choices. It's not just some switch that gets flipped by a monthly cycle.
And that kind of leaves us with one last thought to chew on. If something as basic as attraction is this complicated and is still being figured out, what other hidden forces are out there shaping who we are? What other big ideas we have about ourselves are just the first chapter in a much deeper, more fascinating story? Thanks for tuning in.